plus a bunch of other sort of groups. So a few like blockchain technology communities. For example, this one in the corner, the Coalition of Automated Legal Entities, Coalition of Automated Legal Applications, sorry, which is kind of like a blockchain group that started to try and provide a more alternative voice in the blockchain community. And in general, what I'm trying to do a lot of the time is to see how different types of communities are approaching financial reform and to see like what their different assumptions are and their bases are, and to try and sort of translate between them. But today I'm going to launch into a kind of a sort of new section of work that I've been doing on cashless society and the dynamics of digital payment systems. I thought I would start by putting this slide up here. This is a money burning, the cult of money burning. So like that side of that money burning altar is actually a money burning that I ran in the Californian desert last year, where you get people to come and burn their cash. And it's actually a very, very interesting thing to try and do as both a personal experience, but also as a teaching tool, because it suddenly gets people to really grapple with all the taboos around money, what they really think about it. And actually, this is a magazine run by a friend of mine, which is an entire magazine for money burners. It's called The Burning Issue. The second issue is coming out soon. And this theme of money burning has been around in many sort of popular films and so on, like the Joker burning money in Batman. But the whole thing about this is you get people to ask themselves, am I destroying value when I burn these notes? And it cuts straight to the core of, does this money really actually somehow contain value within it? And the conclusion they very quickly come to is, no, it doesn't actually do that. What I'm doing is I'm giving up my ability to command other people's labor or to command the value that's embedded in products that are created through other people's labor. And in a sense, it could be thought of as a kind of a sacrifice. You're giving up your personal claim on an economic network. If you then ask them, how would you burn digital money? It becomes very conceptually confusing for people because they actually frequently fail to sort of understand what digital money actually is. So the first sort of impulse is, oh, maybe we should burn our phones or like burn our computers somehow. And then you point out, no, I mean, these things are basically ways for you to interact with the digital money system. You don't actually store your digital money on your phone. So this is quite a good exercise for people to suddenly come to terms with the fact that they do not actually directly control digital money. Digital money systems always involve some kind of intermediary that you're asking to essentially edit data for you. If you actually did want to destroy digital money or burn it, you would have to go to one of these data centers and actually try to burn it down, which is quite difficult. And probably actually, even if you destroyed one of these data centers, it probably wouldn't work. There'd be a lot of backup data centers. You have to destroy so many of these things. But you know, this television show, Mr. Robot, this is one of the themes in that. He actually wasn't trying to destroy money. He was trying to destroy student loan records. But there's a similar principle. I mean, that's on the asset side of a bank. But you would basically have to be trying to destroy data centers. And these data centers are the sort of the heart of the monetary system in a way, or at least the infrastructural heart of them. The movement of money around the world is going through all these giant data centers. So this is kind of like, maybe if you're trying to address this issue with people, this is a good way to start off, to get them to sort of conceptualize through this medium of money burning. By the way, who has actually burnt money here as a matter of interest? All right. You should go do it. It's really interesting. What always happens is people start with a very small amount, like a $1 bill, and then they get like into it. They suddenly burn a $10 bill because suddenly they feel this strange release of like, wow, I just was able to give up and I could break this taboo. It's really interesting. But one of the main problems right now in the general public, and not only the general public, also in intellectual elites and so on, is that actually there's still this idea, or there's this idea of like the cash form or the physical form somehow being, I don't know how you describe it, like the sort of like standard default money, the kind of like sort of sometimes maybe like the original money. That's kind of like it's just the default image in your head, and you know this if you go into Google Images and you type money in. This is the pictures that you will get. They are always pictures of cash, all right? I mean, without fail, they always find physical incarnations of money. And if you then go and type into Google Images digital money, you get a very strange phenomenon. You get pictures of cash sort of dissolving into data, or else cash flying through wires, or else like a hand coming through a laptop computer trying to grab cash. So there's still a sense that, again, cash is the original form, and then it's somehow becoming data. And it's very, very pervasive. You never ever see any images of data centers or banks, for example, in these pictures. Of course, now Bitcoin has suddenly emerged into the imagery of digital money. One of a sort of project I was collaborating with last year was at the MIT Media Lab on like how would you actually visualize in visual form digital money? Because actually you could argue that one of the sort of ways that pervasive myths around finance are perpetuated is through photojournalism and newspapers, the constant imagery that's pushed out about what money is. And we're grappling with whether you could actually meaningfully represent digital money without resorting to these kind of objects. And actually, it's extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult because you're trying to basically convey the idea of data changes, and then even then, it's like, is it the binary code? Is it like, there's all sorts of ways you can approach how to visualize digital money, but it's a big sort of mental block in society. This problem extends into the highest realms of the financial sector. This is an article in Wired magazine from some apparently hotshot VC from Andreessen Horowitz, which is one of the big Silicon Valley VC firms. And he has this story, it's a traditional story that's always pumped out about money, right? It's like, once upon a time there was barter, and then we worked out we could use some kind of physical form, and then it became like notes, and now it's going to become digital, right? There's this sort of trajectory that's always pushed out. And I've been to like many of these fintech events and things, future of money events, where this is the story that's completely unquestioned. And obviously in this community, people have a much stronger grasp normally, but it's still very, very pervasive in these groups. This is another one from Warwick Business School, an event I was at, where again you had the same story. Money is transubstantiating into data. It originally was physical, now it's becoming data, as if money never was previously an accounting system or a data system, right? So this is a very big mental, and it's embedded in all our language about how we even talk about money, the fact that it's moving and storing it and all these kind of like physical analogies. It's embedded in like many things like, this is the Panama Papers that came out about politicians, criminals, and the rogue industries that hide their cash. I mean, really, a lot of this Panama paper stuff involved bank deposits. It didn't involve cash systems, all right? There's an entire industry around essentially moving bank deposits around so they can't be seen. This was it even happens to me when I'm writing articles. So like, this is one of my first pieces on kind of like potential surveillance implications of cashless society. And the sub-editors went and took it, and they wrote there, "A future without money would mean this thing." And I got so angry. I was like, well, what are you guys talking about? Like, this is, money is not just cash. We're not talking about a moneyless society. We're talking about a system where cashless, which is different to moneyless, but this association that's just one and the same thing. And perhaps most problematically, I mean, I know David Wallman. He's a cool guy, but I guess the editors of this book, which is one of his big book on cashless society, called it The End of Money again. All right, so you find this pervasive pushing out this idea that like basically cash and money that's the whole complex, and there's no other form of money. So this is a really big issue. So part of like what I try to do when I've been engaging with this issue is to sort of try and reorientate the discussion. With this crowd here, I'm probably not going to go too deeply into this. If you're working with students, for example, you have to go lots into the sort of how to think about money differently. So I'll skirt quite quickly over this. I have this thing. I never believe money can store value. It's a claim upon value. And the basic two ways that you implement the system of recording these monetary claims is either in a physical bearer instrument form. This is how people often think about it. In this way, getting rich means you have to accumulate this physical form and kind of store it, and then you physically move it around. All right. And the other way, which obviously is as prevalent historically, is simply recording it into existence or writing it into existence as data. All right, on a ledger that's controlled by a person who keeps that ledger, and then you communicate with them, asking them to change that data. I mean, the monetary historians in here will probably maybe quibble with the various details, but this in general is basically what's happening. And this could be for a state money or else bank-created money. And in this system here, getting rich means accumulating a high score next to your name on an account system. All right. And a large part of the way that a cashless society is often presented is they say, oh, it's an update to this bearer instrument form, all right? cash is evolving into digital. But actually what cashless society is, it's an evolution of the ledger form. You're basically just automating your ledger systems and digitizing them. And this is actually now the form that it would take. Atomic structures on hard drives rather than a pen on paper or a quill pen on parchment. And this is a very crude representation of how you might sort of loosely conceptualize this. You have these data centers controlled by banks and data centers controlled by central banks, and then you can do your credit creation and stuff within the system, and people then interact with it via interfaces, via, for example, their mobile phones. Which then was when you ask people to conceptualize how you destroy digital money, they're always thinking about the sort of the interaction device, the phone. I must destroy my phone, rather than thinking about that whole system there. And then, this is the communication systems that we have, the ways that we interact with that system. I mean, the ATM network is maybe a slightly a separate thing, but this is the basic way that we touch that system, or touch the digital money system. In the fintech world, though, there's this whole kind of push that's currently going on to sort of romanticize certain forms of interaction with the money system over others. One of the I actually just did another talk on fintech in the other room. Some of you might have seen this. I'm only going to speak about this aspect of fintech, but one of the big elements of fintech is, it's basically two things. You're either automating financial professionals, or you're automating the way that you interact with them. Okay, either the internal world of finance, or the sort of the way that you touch it. And basically what the fintech industry likes to do is just remove those options there. So say, we're going to take away these potential interaction options and replace them with a sort of a myriad of various ways you can use, for example, different phone apps, right? But in essence, it represents a reduction of choice rather than an increase in choice. At least, within a frame, there's a whole bunch of new choices, but then there's a gradual actual removal of choice in general. Or they add new layers on top of the system. And that's the other thing the fintech industry does, is just sort of put new layers on top. And this is kind of bleeding in now into a public narrative that sort of the digitization of finance and these types of things is the future, and the inevitable future, and the automatic kind of more advanced form. So for example, Monopoly now will have these, rather than the old cash, they have these digital payment systems that you can use when you're playing Monopoly. And this is presented as updating, moving into the future. And often there's this type of a narrative pushed out by the technology industry that this is inevitable. You cannot stop it. It's just what people want. All right? It's an interesting question. I mean, if I had to ask this room to say, raise your hands if you would like the option to use digital payment. Okay, most people will tend to agree we would like the option to use digital payment. That's very uncontroversial. People like to have new choices available to them. If I reframe it and I say something like, raise your hand if you do not want to be able to use cash. Okay, the hand count is much lower, because you're basically saying, we're going to remove something from you and stop you from having an option, right? But the whole sort of linguistic game around cashless society is to try and associate the idea of digital payment with not being able to use cash, all right, rather than saying you can have them both in some kind of hybrid system. And this is a sort of key part of the framing. And actually, this very term, cashless society, is interesting because it's a euphemistic way of saying the bank payments society, because eventually, even if you're using these sort of fintech companies, it all ends up back in the bank payment system at some point. All right, so it's kind of like describing a situation by what is not there rather than by what is actually there. And it would be analogous to calling an all-cash economy the bankless economy, or a bankless society, rather than just saying it's a cash economy. And this is part of how you kind of, it would be an interesting thing if you reframe this and ask people, do you want a bank payment society versus do you want a cashless society, and see how the perceptions change. So this brings me on to this point here about this concept of the war on cash. I mean, this is kind of like an incendiary sort of rhetorical way of saying this. Not everyone agrees that there's an overt war happening on cash. But as I pointed out, most people don't essentially have a massive problem with cash. People like be able to use digital, but nobody's going through the streets feeling anger about the fact, or some giant injustice that cash exists, right? The main people who actually feel that cash is a negative thing that should be removed is a particular industry of people who benefit from its removal. And this is what I call the war on cash, and it's waged on a daily basis by a whole range of financial technology companies, payments companies, banks themselves, and also kind of maybe you kind of call like futurist or like modernist type people who like to think that they are progressing into a more advanced society. And they want to sort of surround themselves with the idea of like moving past analog types of forms. I actually wrote an article called The War on Cash. All this imagery comes from that article that I wrote. So if I don't get through it today, you can go and read that article. I also wrote an article called In Praise of Cash. So these were two big pieces. If you're not following me today, you can kind of go and refer back. But the artist was trying to convey this idea of digital payments companies or banks and the payments companies that work in concert with them are deliberately trying to demonize the cash system in people's eyes. And kind of like convey this idea to make them think that it is an inevitable progress. And you can see very overt examples of this. Visa is one of the most obvious. This actually comes off Visa's sort of like in the back, their backyard of their website. They've kind of got this like press release. And it's amazing, they actually sort of overtly state, so they launched this campaign in London. It was called Cash Free and Proud. And they overtly state the campaign is the latest step in Visa UK's long-term strategy to make cash peculiar by 2020. All right, they have to actually like engineer this feeling. And so they will overtly push this type of propaganda out, as it were. Visa has also jumped recently onto the Indian demonetization or decashification, should I say, a situation, and they started putting out these adverts in India, and you should go and actually watch this video. What it shows, and they call it kindness is cashless. It shows this old man, he's a teacher, and he has these young students who play on their mobile phones, and he feels a bit, archaic and stuff. And one day he's waiting in this long queue to go to the ATM, a situation engineered by the Indian government itself. And his students come up and they kind of like show him how to use digital payment, and this is kind of a heartwarming type of thing where he feels that he can learn from younger people and so on. It's all about like wisdom and stuff. And it's a very distinctly self-interested way to make people again feel like there's some kind of warmth and fuzzy feeling to digital payment systems. But one of the most interesting things about this is that the way that you can actually engineer discontent towards cash is by making the cash infrastructure more inconvenient. All right? This is a process that happens throughout society in many ways. I'll quickly jump to, I'll get to that point in a little while. There are other players who are in this game right now. Obviously, states themselves have a big at least certain states have a lot of concern around the cash system. But interestingly enough, this issue is suddenly becoming a political issue in the context of the rise of power in the fintech sector. So the lobbying and the sort of propaganda pushed out by the digital payments industry is leading into making it more feasible for politicians to start to make these calls. So this was a paper released recently by RUSI, which is a very old and respected think tank in the UK. I actually spoke at the launch of this paper, and it was written by Peter Sands, who's the ex-CEO of Standard Chartered Bank, and he's at Harvard now, and he's pushing out this case, which they view as a very sort of balanced case, where they say, we don't want to remove cash, we just want to make it harder to use large amounts of it, right? And this will be an ideal balance, because we'll stop terrorist financing and various forms of criminal activity, which often involve large amounts of cash, but whilst preserving the ability of ordinary individuals to maintain the use of cash. And it all seems very prudent and quite well balanced to start off with, but then you actually read through this report, and you notice there's absolutely no critique of the digital finance sector. So what they're saying is cash isn't always bad. Sometimes it has usefulness for sort of small retailers and people, but there's nothing in the report saying there are negative elements to digital finance. All right, so in a sense, it sets up this kind of situation where we will put this cap on the usage of cash, and then in the report it actually overtly states we can slowly lower it over time as people get used to digital payments. All right, this is essentially a ratcheting mechanism. All right, you make it harder to use the cash at a certain level, and then you ratchet it down, and you get people used to it again. It's politically feasible because You don't immediately say they can't use cash, but this is precisely how you would implement a cashless society. You slowly make it harder and harder to use the cash infrastructure, and you push them over into the digital finance sector. And to go to this point about how you engineer these types of consent, this is a different example of self-checkout counters in supermarkets. I'm not sure how prevalent these are in the US, but certainly in the UK, these are becoming really big. And initially, the way they're always presented is, this is a convenient new option for you, all right? You don't have to wait at the cashier. You can just go straight and you can do self-service, all right? No more service, do self-service, right? And initially, to people, this seems like a new option. It's kind of shiny, it's modern, and you might go use those. But this will subsequently be used by those retailers to justify why they're going to fire their staff. They say, well, people are now using some people are now using these. We can now get rid of the staff. In doing so, they make it more inconvenient to use the staff, so more people are forced to use these here, right? So you create this, you sort of engineer the demand for these by making the other system more inconvenient. And this is precisely what's happening with digital finance. Right now, it's seen as one of these things that you can use. It's kind of cool. But I guarantee you in 20 years' time, as this process carries on, it will no longer be an option. You will simply have to use it, regardless of your particular desires or choices. And this you see with lots of technology. It initially starts off as a consumer choice, and later becomes a de facto necessity. And if you don't use it, you'll be marginalized. And the long-term impulse for a lot of banks is that they can cut costs through these methods, right? And this is what creates the pressure gradient to slowly try and force people off the analog systems. There's also, you guys, I imagine some of you know Kenneth Rogoff. He wrote a big sort of tirade against cash. Well, not a tirade. I mean, it's a balanced. He's a respectable person, obviously. But this book has been really leaped upon by the digital payments industry around the world to sort of justify the case for getting rid of cash. Interestingly, Kenneth Rogoff noticed. I'm imagining. I'm trying to picture what happened. He was touring the world's intellectual salons, kind of like giving talks about his book, and he's being received by various dignitaries and so on. And he started to get pushback from people, saying, what about the privacy implications? What about the financial inclusion implications? And you see, this is his London economics talk, LSE talk, and he kind of adds this little section. He's going to address the concerns about privacy and the fact that maybe people who are not very profitable to be banks will be excluded from the system. So this kind of takes us onto the sort of counter lobby, as it were, who are trying to argue that we should maintain the cash system. I was actually, a few months ago, I was in Kuala Lumpur at the Global Banknote Industry Conference. The global banknote industry suddenly likes me because I wrote these articles, and they're like, oh, come and talk, and they kind of cheer in the crowd. That's sort of which is quite interesting. But the banknote industry doesn't really have a public presence at all, because in reality, they're not the ones who sort of represent the notes. The central bank's cash departments are the ones who actually kind of market the notes, as it were. There's no private company that goes out into the press and pushes out a story about why you should keep cash. All right? Actually, these banknotes are made by several different companies who collaborate to make different elements of them. And central banks will commission them to make these different elements. So there's no coherent voice to the cash sector, as it were. It's often experienced as a public utility that's just there. There's no private company that promotes it. So actually, the cash industry has suddenly now realized this, and they're trying to create a voice to provide a counter lobby. So this is one of them. This is the International Currency Association, and it's called Cash Matters. It's one of their sort of campaigns to sort of put out videos and counter the sort of PayPal, Apple Pay, big companies of this world who are pushing out the other story. So yeah, this is kind of intriguing, and they're trying to develop a narrative, and it basically goes like this. The narrative being pushed out by the digital payments industry is that what you do is you demonize cash, and then you contrast it against a very romantic vision of digital, all right? And this leads to this kind of thing of saying, get rid of cash and fully go digital. The way that you counter that is that you put positive spins on cash, you point out its various positive elements, the fact that it's a public utility, doesn't exclude anybody can use it. It's very resilient, there's no central point of failure. If a data center goes down, it doesn't suddenly disappear. And then you put a negative spin on the digital payment system. You talk about the surveillance, you talk about the financial exclusion that can come from this. There's various negative elements, and you can then come to a conclusion about we should maintain a hybrid system. All right? But this latter narrative is way often less powerful than the former narrative, which goes with the general sort of tech optimistic kind of narrative that you find more generally. It's interesting to look at a historical example right now. I found this the other day. This is the world's first automobile advert. And it says, dispense with a horse. You know, we found a more advanced way of doing transport. You know, you no longer need your horse-drawn carriage. And you can see here, in these early days, the idea that there was this idea that motor vehicles would naturally surpass horses and other forms of transport like that, and they were something of the past, right? Right now, what's going on in the digital payments industry is they're trying to present cash like that. They say, you know, cash is like the ox-drawn cart of the payment system, and we have this fast system that will be much, much better. If you want to reframe this in a quite a powerful way, you don't talk about horses, you talk about bicycles. In our modern transportation systems, we actually maintain multiple forms of transport. And interestingly enough, bicycles actually have a massive resurgence in places like Europe, where they're often seen now to be a response to the problems caused by cars, okay? AKA congestion, urban sprawl, pollution, accidents, and so on. And actually, people often find bicycles more convenient in certain situations if you're doing short journeys. Obviously, you're not going to use a bicycle to travel 1,000 kilometers, but you're going to use it in certain situations. And as soon as you reframe the cash versus digital debate like this, it really changes the dynamic. People suddenly say, all right, okay, I can see that. I actually might want to maintain these different forms of payment that have different types of characteristics in different situations. The types of people who will be very easily integrate into these digital payment systems tend to be people like this. They're people who have, they might have sort of slightly different characteristics, but in general, they're within formal economies. They have identities that are well established. They've got certain markers of sort of formal respect, like university degrees and sort of jobs and these kind of things. And these types of people tend to find the whole sort of story around cashless society rather unproblematic. It seems, oh, yeah, sure, this is, you know, I have no problem accessing digital payment systems. This is great. But this is the sort of community in the financial and say international development that people start to get concerned about. And it's not just people in Vietnamese rice paddy farmers. It's anybody who doesn't really fit the profile of a large bureaucratic corporation, all right? Who doesn't want to deal with a homeless person, for example, or a sex worker, or people working in sort of marginalized positions in various places. So there's one of the critiques around this cashless drive is what happens to the people who can't basically make banks a profit? Because the whole sort of dynamic around financial inclusion is it costs money to extend services, and how much are we going to get back, and how much risk are we going to take in the process? All right. And these people tend to find themselves on the wrong side of that risk-reward equation. All right. They tend to get excluded. And one of the drives in fintech for sort of international development is how do we lower the cost of providing these services through forms of technology and so on. But in reality, cash still forms a very vital backdrop to most of these economies. And this goes back to its role as a public utility. You do not need to approach somebody to ask if you can use it. It's just there. And I think the MMT community will probably have takes from this. But this is precisely what the state cash system does. Interestingly, though, there is a how much longer I should talk another 10 minutes. Is that cool? Are you good? I'm good. I'm going to take a sip of water as well. Give you guys a break. This is a very intriguing organization. They're trying to turn the narrative on its head. So like I've just said, there's a concern around financial exclusion. All right? And a lot of people who actually work in international development recognize this. Better Than Cash Alliance, though, is trying to re-engineer that argument to make it work it the other way around. All right? They're saying cash is dragging people down in these economies, and digital will bring people out of poverty. It's rather uncontroversial, the idea that if you're living in an all-cash economy and somebody then introduces a digital payment system, that's probably a good thing. That's probably going to give you some new options. It might help you in certain ways. There's various positive elements to introducing digital payment systems into an all-cash economy. But that's quite a different thing to saying you should get rid of the cash system, right? And that's actually what the Better Than Cash Alliance is arguing. And interestingly, it's a little bit like, to go back to the transport analogy, it's like a lobby group for public buses, for example, or let's say like bus systems, a private bus system. starting up an alliance called the Better Than Bicycles Alliance. You don't say buses are good. You try to demonize the other things, get rid of it, right? And you start to wonder why this narrative has been created. And the sort of conspiracy theorists who kind of get onto this website will suddenly, I'm not actually a conspiracy theorist, but I start to see certain patterns in these. And actually, these are the funders of the Better Than Cash Alliance. It includes the traditional sort of mainstream of international development, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Midian Network, and then you notice these other guys, Visa, MasterCard, the Citi Foundation, and then they kind of run it through this UN agency. And I've done digging around this. These guys followed me on Twitter for a while because they thought I was pro what they were doing. And I was sort of bantering with them on Twitter direct message. And I was like, hey, this is interesting, how to get on your mailing list and so on. And they would talk with me. And then I started going to the website and I looked at their executive board, and they have all these boards, but they won't say who's on these boards. Right? There's no transparency about who actually sits, who actually steers this organization. So I asked them, I was like, can you please tell me who's on your board? So the next thing that they did not respond, and then they unfollowed me on Twitter. So this is quite interesting. I don't know if that's just arbitrary or random, but they suddenly withdrew any kind of contact with me. So I started asking around various friends who work in international development, who work in aid and humanitarian aid, and they dabbled around, and I don't have the exact names of everybody, but essentially it is representatives from all these organizations who control it. Again, you don't have to have a conspiracy type mindset, but it's pretty obvious that people who believe that they should work for MasterCard are probably people who also believe in the positive benefits of digital. So there's definitely a skewed ideological structure in this organization. And one of the key sort of things they're trying to do is to get big corporates to join as partners with them as a sort of transmission mechanism for promoting cashlessness. So for example, Unilever, another one is H&M, the big sort of clothes manufacturers who have lots of low-end workers who get paid in cash. And so they're trying to convince them to basically get via their supply chains to promote this idea. I actually spoke to a sustainable textiles entrepreneur from Bangladesh who said he had been pressured by one of these companies to change his systems to digital because they were members of this alliance. So there's this whole kind of something's going on here, which is worth bearing in mind. I want to quickly address this whole thing around the surveillance implications of this, because this is one of the angles. So there's the whole sort of debate around financial inclusion versus exclusion and what removing a cash system would do with that. But then there's a whole sort of separate debate around what are the surveillance implications of the system. It's pretty obvious as soon as we go back to the first two slides, if you defer your ability to move money around to centralized entities that control databases, you essentially create this middleman. One, you have to ask them permission to actually do transactions, but two, when you do them, they're getting huge data trails about what's happening. They're building up profiles of you. And this is not just banks, it's also all the various types of payments companies. Even the people who run these phones are starting to try and glean data about how you're making payments. So this whole idea of will this create surveillance systems? And the science fiction realm has touched upon this before. I don't know if you guys have seen The Handmaid's Tale. There's now a sort of a dramatized version of it that's come out. But this is one of the kind of one of the elements of it was essentially I think it was the CompuBank. They stopped the ability to use cash, and then CompuBank froze the accounts of the various women. Have any of you guys read this book or watched the thing? And basically, this is the idea: is as soon as you have control over people's ability to move money around, you can start to control their bodies in certain types of ways. You can control what they're able to do. And so it's not merely an issue of surveillance, so watching what people are doing. It's actually being able to almost censor people's economic activities. If you do not wish for them to engage in certain types of things, you can say, we reject those payments. For example, you will not be allowed to travel. Okay, we reject travel payments. You can stay in this area, but you cannot move. Of course, these scenarios, we haven't really seen them transpiring very much, but this is something that the sort of science fiction imagination starts to wonder about. Is this actually hypothetically possible? Is this something we should be guarding against? One of the places right now, which is really interesting to look at, is China, where there's been this massive upsurge in mobile payment systems. And there's various articles coming out. This was the New York Times, I think, saying cash is becoming obsolete in China. Everyone's using Alipay and WeChat. to make payments. These are two companies controlling massive amounts of the payments transactions between citizens and getting huge amounts of data, and the Chinese government has access to them as well. All right. This is something people should be making scenarios about. There are actually various Chinese activists who are looking at this and starting to get very concerned about this huge centralization of power in the system. And this has also been something that's been picked up by various people in the US before. This is actually a guy called Paul Armour, who was, I think, at the Rand Corporation, a kind of computer scientist. I don't know his full background. But back in like 1975, he was writing about this. And he was writing about computers and surveillance and the possibilities of what might happen. And the electronic funds transfer systems were just starting to kick off. And he was one of the first to note, like, oh shit, like what happens if you start to watch everything that's going on? Will this form a new vector of surveillance, a new way to control people? And he actually went and presented in front of the Senate subcommittee some Senate subcommittee on the potential implications. I haven't actually read this testimony, but I'm gonna do it soon. But it's quite interesting. This was back in 1968, I think he was doing this. So it's definitely been in the public domain. And one of the sort of issues, if you ever get involved in privacy communities, one of the throwback things that always happens, people have this strange sort of like subservient impulse. They say, well, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to lose. You know, it's like, this is kind of like, you know, it's almost like your older brother walks into your room and takes your diary and says, I want to look through it. And you say, actually, no, I don't want you to look through my diary. And he says, well, what, you have something to hide? Are you trying to hide something from me? Or what do you have to hide? If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to lose, right? So it's this way of framing the debate from the perspective of the person who's demanding something, rather than actually saying, what gives you the belief that you have the right to do that? And in libertarian philosophy, this is one of the sort of discussions that goes on. And this is a guy who's been talking about this social cooling effect. This idea that when you start to believe that you're being potentially watched, you start to actually monitor and censor your own actions, regardless of whether you're doing anything wrong. And writers like Michel Foucault have talked about the panopticon. So this whole idea that the sense of being watched actually starts to infringe on your very, you start to police yourself. Now, you don't have to believe this. It's worth just like thinking about whether it's a possibility. If people slowly become aware of these systems that are watching them all the time, will they change their behavior? Will they try to game these systems? Will they start to try and mess with the systems in various types of ways? And I put this picture up here because it maybe illustrates the point quite well. In modern sort of alienated, large-scale society, people actually have this need for privacy. You know, you sort of retreat to your house. These sort of moments outside of the public domain where you might sort of have a lover, you might be crying because you didn't get a job, you didn't get a job that you interviewed for. You have this sort of these spaces which are supposed to like protect your sense of self. And actually, it's in these spaces you can often be your most creative as well. All right, you have this sense of like, if the neighbors aren't watching through my window, I might dance naked in the kitchen to some kind of music, right? And the whole sort of insidious nature of the anti-privacy debate is about essentially infringing into these spaces, saying you have no right to believe that you can have privacy. All right, we reserve the right to maybe place a small little camera in the top of your kitchen just to make sure you're not doing anything wrong, you know. And people intuitively actually know what's wrong with that. And it's not about having some kind of criminal impulse or desire to hide from things. I'm almost done. Okay, so this is just a quote about panopticons. And so Michel Foucault was talking about how these are the ideal form of control, because you don't actually have to directly control people. You get them to control themselves. Okay. So my last few points on this, it's not just about big brother bogeyman type figures who are going to try and come and like control you in some kind of like overt sort of heavy-handed way. The main players behind the acquisition of data in society right now are corporate players, right? And corporate players have different agendas. They want to use your data to monitor your behavior such that they can then start to manipulate you in various ways. And this is what the entire field of machine learning is about. I don't know how familiar you guys are with machine learning, but basically it's like churn tons of data through a model, and it will calibrate the model. Rather than you first calibrating it yourself, all right? You use the data to basically train your systems and make predictions or potentially use your past actions to suggest future paths and steer you in various ways. And this type of data is precisely, that's one of the things it's going to be used for. Whether you care about this and you think it's going to cause some kind of like fundamental reduction in human agency. It depends on kind of like how optimistic you are about technological systems. But sort of existentialists have this real problem with this. It's like, you're trying to essentially remove my sense of personal agency in the world by sitting on my shoulder, suggesting things to me all the time. And you'll probably notice on your phones it's happening right now. It's probably telling you right now, do you want to put a photo of this place on Google? You know, it's making these like, it's like sitting there on your shoulder, like constantly like prodding you to do things, right? And it's going to always be there. And this is actually quite a concern for people who believe in some kind of like autonomy. One kind of, okay, I'll end with one last anecdote about this, which is quite an interesting sort of case study about cash. The thin line between criminality, creativity, and progressive change. I'm going to talk about the cannabis industry. I actually spoke at this event a few weeks ago in California. There's a friend of mine who's running it, and he's just like, you know, he's been involved in the cannabis industry, but he's also really interested in cryptocurrency and events. The cannabis industry has been essentially legalized. I don't know what stage it's in right now in California. It's become a legal industry. It's a legitimate business now. And then there's the cryptocurrency industry, which is also in a similar kind of situation, which is saying, you know, we're kind of becoming legitimate. Should we kind of get together? And one of the reasons why this is happening is that the banks are regulated at a federal level and actually can't accept money from the cannabis industry. And as a result, they're accumulating huge amounts of cash. Okay, through this, the cannabis businesses are saying, you know, but we are legitimate businesses now. We don't have to use cash anymore. Why can't we also get access to digital payment systems? It's a little bit like people who've been reliant on bicycles for a long time, and they see cars, and they're like, well, why can't I also get a car, right? And as a result, they become quite anti-cash. And it's ironic because cash is the only thing that's kept the cannabis industry alive, essentially. Without it, it would have died. And it's the only thing that kept it alive for long enough to be legalized. All right, so to actually change societal perspectives. So what's often called criminal is in this gray area where you're trying to decide, like, is this something we should actually bring into the realm of formality or not? So that's quite an intriguing one. I'm going to flip through this to try and go into the crypto part, maybe 5 minutes more. Sorry, I'm going a bit long. Rowan can speak a lot about this. One of the sort of elements of this debate that's coming in is saying, in the hypothetical situation that we do get rid of cash, we will probably have to implement some kind of state digital M0 system, essentially a way to gain direct access to state money. And so Rowan, maybe, I mean, yeah, you can elaborate on that more. So there's this whole idea like the future may not be cash versus bank digital. It might be state digital versus bank digital, all right, which has these kind of like interesting dynamics to it. But then there's a third community that's now and that's Rowan's platform that he's working on if you guys want to ask him about that. A sort of third community is the crypto community, the cryptocurrency community, who for a very long time have been aware of this type of dynamic. And when I say very long time, this is a guy called David Chaum, who back in the 1990s foresaw that in the age of the internet, you'll find huge centralization of power, and you better find a way to preserve privacy in this context. So he started something called DigiCash. I know some guys who worked on this. This was what the origins of what they call the cypherpunk movement, or the crypto anarchists. People saying, you know, we got to be very careful about what's going to happen in the age of the internet with centralization of data. And this has culminated now into Bitcoin and various other types of offshoots. The most advanced sort of privacy currencies that are being developed right now, one's called Zcash. They develop it out of San Francisco. It's based on the same technology as Bitcoin, but with much more advanced cryptography. And there's another one also called Monero, who has a different methodology for creating privacy, private payments in a digital format. So these guys are kind of like trying to say, we need a third option. You know, you might have cash, you might have state digital, and you're going to have bank digital, and then we're going to have this other thing, you know, this sort of digital form of, there's something that's called digital cash or something like that, that has sort of cash-like elements to it, but that is run off a blockchain-based system. I'm going to skip through this. The last reflection about this is that all of this may be academic in certain ways, because we still live in these societies that depend on huge amounts of fossil fuels, which underpin all economic systems, and electricity. All right? And the entire digital realm is based on the integrity of the electricity supply. One of the most compelling arguments for maintaining a cash system is precisely that. If you want to bring down an entire economy that's cashless, just try and hit the electricity supply, and your entire economy will freeze. And people will probably reinvent cash at that point. And so this is like quite an intriguing sort of point for people involved in security studies. A lot of the sort of security community and sort of defense community are thinking about the cash systems are sort of helping terrorists and so on. But then you think about the alternative. A purely digital society actually has enormous attack vectors, very, very high cybercrime vectors that can be extremely disruptive at a much larger scale than a cash system is. So that's maybe the last thing to think about, and I can take some questions or, yeah. One thing which I find strange is I'm not actually I don't want to romanticize cash. I'm not like some kind of fetishist of cash. But I think maybe this debate can be summarized as trying to protect ordinary capitalism from some kind of Minority Report surveillance capitalism. That's sort of like maybe the headline of this.
Sorry, maybe you've addressed these in your articles, but perhaps if you could, I've just wondered. One of them was you sort of raised the, the interference possibilities in terms of the Handmaid's Tale and theoretical almost sort of like quasi-paranoid scenarios. In fact, we've seen this happen with Julian Assange. I mean, they cut off, the payment systems cut off WikiLeaks. And this is, for anybody who's an activist, activists significantly raise money. Online is still going to be your main form of payment. Yep. And and the more the system goes digital, or even cutting out checks, because it also implies cutting out checks as well, not just cutting out cash, but it sort of circumvents other ways people can pay you. And then the second issue I wonder if you can comment on is, because I think that from my perspective the issues are broader than financial inclusion. Again, as a merchant, when I get digital payments, I have a 3% toll. So this isn't just excluding people. This is forcing people who, again, have other payment mechanisms that don't have the same tolling into being forced into an electronic payment regime that's going to transfer more from merchants to the banks.
Sure, yeah. Actually, the WikiLeaks example is one of the well-known ones of an overt example of economic censorship through digital payment systems. I think it was PayPal, MasterCard, Visa refused to process payments for anybody trying to donate to WikiLeaks. So in a sense, they were censoring two parties. They were censoring WikiLeaks itself, but also censoring people who are acting on their consciousness to actually support it. And actually, I don't know all the details of that story, but Bitcoin in that context suddenly became a lifeline to WikiLeaks, and which is one, in the Bitcoin community, there's all of these types of angsty debates about does it fund criminality and so on. And it goes back to this point, is that criminality and political subversion are kind of part of the same complex often. Often political subversion is defined as criminality, and it becomes a very gray area. And as soon as you destroy criminality, you simultaneously destroy the ability for any form of deviance, essentially, right? Any form of a political expression and so on. So there's this whole kind of balancing act, between the authentic need sometimes to actually stop payments going to people you don't want them to go to, but then how you actually prevent that from being extended into some kind of political action from repressive states or companies that are worried about liabilities. And certainly in that case, Bitcoin was a vital lifeline to keep WikiLeaks going. I'm not an expert on the national, the differences between the sort of fees in different countries for why merchants, because in some countries merchants do like cashlessness. I mean, particularly places like Netherlands, if you go there, there's this whole sort of, merchants will often not accept cash, and they're not forced to do that. They will do that deliberately. And it's sort of different. I haven't gone into the nitty-gritty of what the particular economics of that are, but
there are trade-offs because you do get a lot of accountants. So there are merchants even in the US who won't take digital because they just like the simplicity.
They like, exactly, yeah.
And they frankly may not trust their employees.
Sure. So I mean, yeah, this is part of the sort of low-level debate between does it really make sense for individual merchants? Right now, there's no merchants that are being forced to not accept cash. But you could argue that there are actually there's legislation in place in many countries to say merchants are allowed to refuse cash, and that becomes a question: should there be some requirement for anybody who's involved in the market to accept the sort of the money of last resort, the state money system? Or are they allowed to basically exclude people? I mean, one of the examples right now is British Airways. British Airways has just recently announced that it will not accept cash, which is quite ironic because essentially British Airways will not accept British pounds in a way. They'll accept, you know, bank promises for British pounds, but they will not accept British pounds, you know, directly themselves. And I've been in situations on that airline where I refused to pay in digital, and you end up in a strange, awkward situation where they brought you something and they're kind of like, I'm going to have to take it back now. But yeah, I haven't really answered your question properly, but there are, right now, no merchants are being forced to use digital, but it will become a big issue if there was costs involved.
Thank you for presentation. I'm originally from Ukraine, and as many other developing countries, I see a big difference, like between the payment system and the savings. So I would say payment become more and more digital globally, but the savings is all cash, and it will. I don't see any changes for one, like in future, for one reason: no one trusts banks, and I wonder how in other countries, there is such a trust in banks, considering, you know, the management stories and so many fraud activities there. Yeah. So yeah, so I feel like we don't have that threat, because I know for a fact in Ukraine, there is no one who will keep money in a bank unless it's your bank.
Sure, and each country actually has different dynamics. I mean, Germany is well known for having a historical kind of trauma around you know, there's a very high usage of cash in Germany compared to, say, Netherlands and Sweden and stuff. So, and I don't know the particular dynamics of each country and what creates these types of sort of dynamics. But certainly, I mean, it also works the other way around, though. I mean, actually, sometimes you find countries that have high levels of corruption and forms of public sector corruption and business corruption. There's sometimes pushes from within those countries to get rid of cash because it's viewed that it will create more transparency. Which again is a legitimate argument, and you kind of get to this point of like, what is the trade-off happening here between trying to prevent authentically illegitimate forms of transactions and the sort of the privacy aspect, and where do you put that line? And I can't really sort of specify for each individual country where they try to do that. Yeah, but it's certainly the general question is, in the public domain, it's often not, the trade-offs are often not spoken about. So there's kind of these linear arguments made. We want to get rid of criminality and corruption, therefore cash go away. But there's never the sort of the trade-off that comes from that. You know, the fact that now you're basically going to be forced into a formalized, recorded sort of database systems. So yeah, so I kind of skirted around your question. I've been talking for like 2 hours now from my previous talk as well.
Hi,
starting to get a little like slurring my speech.
Hi, thank you for your wonderful and what I see as an anti-imperialist talk, because that's how I see it. Regarding decashification, and I think in India we should stop calling it demonetization and call it decashification. It's difficult to pronounce. But regarding that, one of the greatest people who became disenfranchised by that process were in fact the housewives. I know this isn't a politically correct term, but I use it on purpose because in order to highlight the kind of persecution and oppression that women suffer, especially because they are constantly pulled into capitalist processes but constantly pushed out every time there's a recession. So many of these women are not able to have bank accounts because, you know, it's constantly losing your job all the time makes it very difficult for you to continuously keep a direct deposit and so on. And most of them keep their assets in the form of cash or jewelry. And when there is a crackdown on cash, all of these women lost their assets. So I think from a very gender perspective as well, we should join your struggle and you know, and argue against this trend towards digital currency.
Sure. I mean, I'm not an expert in the financial inclusion, so-called financial inclusion literature. I'm like, anybody who's dealt in the financial inclusion world realizes it has all sorts of problems, because often financial inclusion kind of means opening up access kind of like forcing traditional banking systems into people who maybe doesn't really serve very well, rather than thinking about how do you authentically build financial institutions that would serve those people. So there's a whole sort of history on the financial inclusion debate, but there are a number of studies which look at the gender aspect of these, and the story you just told is one of them. There's another story which is saying around the fact that digital payments will allow women to keep money away from their husbands in various ways, or to control it more. And so the Better Than Cash Alliance tries to put a gender spin on their work. And I do not know the empirical studies and necessarily how legitimate it is. But in general, I'll kind of like beeline a little bit away from this topic, but it's related. Like one of the stories in the international development community is around, for example, the safety of these systems. All right, so you say the cash system is unsafe because you find these people in vulnerable situations. They're keeping cash for themselves, for example, housewives, this can be removed from them. And if we can give them a digital payment system, this basically keeps them, protects them. And it's one of the most absurd arguments ever, because if you ever spend time in rural communities where levels of technological literacy are often very low, you're extremely exposed to technological fraud. If some people can get hold of that device that you have, can get that information out of you, you can drain people's entire savings, never mind just what's in their wallets. All right, so there's this kind of like naive narrative pushed out by the technology industry about somehow this will create much more safety, much more, and it's definitely worth providing a counter voice to counter that sort of tech utopian narrative.
General question, because I'm interested in your general thoughts on the issue. In the war for cash, how do you envision the role of non-state, community-driven, non-crypto currencies? For example, the Brixton Pound, and other projects where people are essentially trying to do the damn thing for themselves.
Well, non-state, non-crypto, yeah. I'm actually on the advisory group of the Brixton Pound. My great contribution to the Brixton Pound was suggesting they build an ATM to create better marketing. Because one of the ways that banks maintain the sort of cultural hegemony is you're constantly walking past their various outlets. And so I thought, put out an ATM for the Brixton Pound so people can walk past and interact with it. Interestingly, I don't really see. In these sort of small scale local currencies, often the point is something different. You're trying to sort of localize control of a currency, create a greater community cohesion, make the economic network smaller essentially, and then you can implement that using a cash system or a digital system. And actually Brixton Pound, for example, implements it in both ways. It keeps the notes for the sort of mental imagery. It's got like the David Bowie notes and so on. And that's important to create almost like the brand of the currency. And then the actual day-to-day stuff is done through text messaging. But bear in mind that the Brixton Pound, it's a much smaller organization. The power dynamics are so different. Whether it's so I don't imagine the Brixton Pound is going to become a vector for surveillance and things like that. But whether it's a kind of a response to stuff like the Brixton Pound is a response to the alienating scale of the banking system and the existing payment systems. So a lot of it's about saying we want to reduce the size of the economic network to a scale that people feel is more human and more connected. So you put it into a city where people are so used to sort of interaction with strangers that you don't know and you'll have no lasting connection with. And they say, let's try and use a money form to re-engineer community ties, which is quite interesting because you could historically probably argue that money is one of the things that sort of loosens ties. But yeah, the local currency systems in general are about trying to bring back forms of community autonomy in the face of a much larger centralized banking system. So in that sense, they might provide actual alternatives. And hypothetically, if you did have a cashless society, they might actually flourish as alternative means of staying in smaller networks so your data is not subject to these larger networks, if that makes sense. But we can discuss it. I don't know exactly
Then just due to time constraints, we're going to end it there. So thank you to Brett.
Cool. I'll be around as well, so we can chat.